Well, hello. My name is Kevin Woyce. I'm an author and a photographer here in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, and speaking to you today about the history of the lighthouses along the Hudson River. And I'd like to start with the very first of those lighthouses. It's built all the way back in 1826. Not a very tall lighthouse, but it doesn't really need to be. It stands on top of a wooded peninsula on the west side of the Hudson River called Stony Point. And that hill is about 150 feet high. So you could see the light from quite a distance. After dark, the lantern was lit up with 7 oil lamps. Each of those was fitted with a big metal reflector to capture and reflect as much of the light as possible outwards. Of course, that also meant that the lightkeeper's job was not done when the sun came up in the morning. Each morning, all of those lamps had to be drained and cleaned, all of the glass had to be polished to remove the soot and the smoke, and that was done first thing in the morning so that late afternoon they were ready to refill the lamps and relight the lantern. Now, by the time this lighthouse was built, Stony Point was already a famous spot along the Hudson River. Colonial troops were stationed there during the early years of the American Revolution, at least until a British force drove them out in May of 1779. The British quickly fortified the hill and cut down all the trees on the hillside. That way nobody could storm that hill without being seen. The British considered Stony Point an important part of their strategy. The Royal Navy already controlled the Atlantic Ocean, and they figured if they could also gain control of the Hudson River, they would basically be dividing the colonies in half. They would separate New England, where the trouble started, from the rest of the colonies, and maybe bring the war to a quick end. So that's why in July, George Washington sent a force commanded by General Anthony Wayne to recapture Stony Point. Some historians have called the general Mad Anthony, at least in part because of the daring plans he worked out that nobody else might have attempted. The British had built wooden barricades out into the Hudson River, but General Wayne just waited until the middle of the night when the tide was out and marched his troops around those barricades. He then sent them up that hillside with their guns unloaded, bayonets fixed, but he didn't want to take a chance of alerting the British with a stray shot. So they did take the British completely by surprise, and we recaptured Stony Point, but only held it for a short time, because by then George Washington was already building a much stronger fort just a few miles up the river at West Point, later the site of the United States Military Academy. Although the building here is the West Point Museum, it was not built as part of the Military Academy. This building was originally a Catholic college, later purchased by the Academy. Now, at West Point, the Hudson River makes 2 right-angle turns in just about a quarter of a mile, and that creates a bottleneck for shipping traffic. Ships have to slow to a crawl to navigate those turns, and that made this a very easy spot to defend. So we had gun batteries on the riverbank, on the shore of Constitution Island at the top of the map, and also on top of the cliffs at West Point. It was so well defended the British never did try to attack this fort, although Benedict Arnold did try to sell them the surrender. But all of the things that made West Point a great place for a fort, well, they remained navigational hazards well into the 19th century. So in 1853, the government built a small lighthouse at the foot of the cliffs, replaced it in 1872 with this hexagonal wooden tower, which remained in use right up until 1946, when it was replaced by a much smaller automated beacon, which is still there. Now, the Hudson River is more than 300 miles long, but only the lower half of it, from the falls at Troy, New York, down to New York Harbor, are actually navigable. The river starts way up in the Adirondacks. The source wasn't discovered until the 1870s. The source is a spot called Lake Tier of the Clouds, which is on the side of New York's highest mountain. Mount Marcy is a little over a mile high. But even this lower navigable part of the river tends to be shallow and muddy. It takes regular dredging to keep a 32-foot deep shipping channel open up to Albany and Troy. The river also has its share of twists and turns. There are islands, there are shallows, there are mud flats, some of them right in the middle of the river. This is the view from on top of Bear Mountain, New York. And all of these hazards were completely invisible to sailors after dark or in foggy weather. But the Hudson was quickly becoming one of the nation's busiest rivers, the highway up into New York State from America's busiest port. This is the view of Lower Manhattan from the ferry docks in the Paulus Hook section of Jersey City, New Jersey. Now, for a long time, the most common vessels on the Hudson were made for the river. They were shallow draft sailing ships called Hudson River sloops. They only traveled in whichever direction the tide was flowing, and the captains would tie them up after dark or during foul weather. So any of those hazards on the river, it was enough to mark those with posts or flags or after dark with lanterns. But things were starting to change along the Hudson. Robert Fulton was born out in Pennsylvania in 1765. We know him today as an inventor, but he started out as an artist. And by 1800, he was living in Paris and making a living painting murals. But he was also continuing with his experimenting and inventing. And in 1801, he demonstrated one of his inventions for the Emperor Napoleon. He called this boat the Nautilus. And in this picture, it looks like an ordinary sailboat. In fact, it worked just like an ordinary sailboat. Until you took down the sails and the masts and sealed all of the hatches. At that time, it became what Fulton called a plunging boat. We would call it a submarine today. Well, Napoleon wasn't interested, and Fulton couldn't find any other buyers. Decades later, Jules Verne would borrow the name Nautilus for the submarine in his novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But Fulton, he turned his attention back to his original interest, and that was building steam-powered vessels. And that captured the attention of the United States minister to France, Robert Livingston. He was a major landowner along the Hudson River. He had a big estate called Claremont. He served on the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. He negotiated the Louisiana Purchase with Napoleon. And after seeing an experimental steamboat running on the Delaware River, this was during the writing of the Constitution, he convinced the New York State legislature to grant him a monopoly on all steamboat travel on the Hudson River. Of course, now what he needed was a practical steamboat. And it turns out that's exactly what Fulton could provide. In 1807, Robert Fulton left New York City aboard a 130-foot steamship he called the North River. North River was the old Dutch name for the Hudson. What we call the Delaware River, they called the South River. Well, he traveled all the way up to Livingston's estate, about 100 miles. He then renamed the boat after the estate, called it the Claremont, and by September of 1807, Fulton and Livingston were running regularly scheduled service up and down the Hudson. And that monopoly outlived them both. It lasted until 1824. Now, while the monopoly was in effect, there were not supposed to be any other steamships on the river. But several companies tried to break in, and one of them hired a young Cornelius Vanderbilt as a steamship captain. Vanderbilt got the job at least partly because he was willing to take some risks. It seems that there was a loophole in the laws that said the police could not impound a vessel if they couldn't find the captain aboard. So whenever Vanderbilt thought that he might be boarded, he'd find somewhere to hide. And he got away with this more than once. But after the monopoly ended, Vanderbilt started his own steamship line, gave himself the title of Commodore, and quickly drove most of his competitors out of business. By the late 1860s, he was also buying up railroads around New York State. He combined those to create the New York Central system, and he built himself a personal fortune that's considered second only to John D. Rockefeller's. And once you had competing steamship lines on the river, the owners of each line wanted to be able to advertise that they offered the fastest service on the river. Because the steamboats, they were now traveling from early in the morning until late in the evening. They did not have to run with the tides. They still usually tied up after dark or in foul weather. But sometimes if the captain of a steamship saw a ship from a rival line, he might decide to race it along the river. That wasn't always the smartest thing to do. If you pushed the boilers too hard on those early steamships, they might explode and set the wooden ship on fire. But there was also a real chance that if you were running fast along that river and the light or the weather wasn't perfect, a good chance you might run aground on one of those shallows or mud flats or other hazards. Of course, traffic on the river would also increase after the Erie Canal opened in October of 1825. It had taken 8 years to build that canal. No modern machinery, so it had to be dug by hand, and it cost about $7 million, and that was in 1820s currency. Well, the canal was more than 350 miles long, 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, started on Lake Erie just below Buffalo, New York, and then crossed New York State to the Hudson River. On the Hudson, steamships would be waiting to tow strings of canal boats, 50 to 100 at a time, to and from New York City. Now, when the canal was being built, a lot of people around New York thought that it was a complete waste of money, that there was no way this thing could ever be a success. But it was, almost immediately. And within 10 years, there were as many as 3,000 boats in operation on the canal every day that it was open. Well, because it crosses northern New York, it was closed in the winter. The water would freeze. Between Buffalo and Albany, the canal drops 571 feet in elevation. So originally there were 83 stone locks along that canal, each one of them raised or lowered boats just a dozen feet. As technology improved, the number of locks was greatly reduced, and in the 1830s the owners began completely rebuilding that canal, widening and deepening it so that it could carry more and larger vessels. Along the way, the canal turned a lot of small New York towns into major industrial cities or shipping centers, but the canal was mostly replaced by railroads in the late 19th century and then by trucking in the 20th century. But it's still there. It's still used for sightseeing and tourism. And this brings us back to that first lighthouse on the Hudson, because the Stony Point light was built the year after the canal opened. And it marks an important transition on the Hudson. If you're traveling north along the river, just south of Stony Point, you're in the widest part of the river. It's called Haverstraw Bay, and it's about 3 miles across. But as soon as you round Stony Point, you find a somewhat different Hudson River. It's much narrower, it's running faster, winding between the mountains of what they call the Highlands region. One of the early keepers at Stony Point was a man named Robert Parkinson. He was appointed in 1829. And he had a family connection there at Stony Point. His grandfather was one of the American soldiers who stormed the hill back in July of 1779. The next keeper also had a family connection. His name was Alexander Rose. He was appointed in 1853, and he was married to Robert Parkinson's niece. Her name was Nancy. Well, in 1857, Alexander Rose was carrying wood down that 150-foot hillside to build a fog signal tower on the riverbank. Now, I've never found a picture of the one that used to stand at Stony Point, but this is a similar tower that stood near the West Point Lighthouse. Ironically, this one was destroyed in the 1920s when a ship crashed into it on a foggy day. Now, the fog signal tower had a bell inside, and that was supposed to be rung by clockwork machinery. So theoretically, all the keeper had to do was go out to that tower a few times each night and wind up the machinery. But these things were notorious for seizing up just when they were needed most. Then it was the keeper's job to get his hammer and bang on that bell 3 or 4 times a minute until the fog cleared. And there are stories of keepers doing that literally for days on end. Well, Alexander Rose was not one of them. As he was carrying the wood down the hillside to build the tower, he collapsed of a stroke or a heart attack and died. That left his widow, Nancy, to take over as lightkeeper. And she must have liked the job. She stayed on for the rest of her life. She lived until 1904. After that, their daughter Melinda stayed on for another year or so. Now, unlike the earliest keepers, Nancy did not have to deal with those 7 oil lamps, because starting in the 1850s, The United States Lighthouse Board installed imported Fresnel lenses in all of our lights. These were made in France, later on in England, and they used a system of glass prisms in a brass frame to focus the light of a single oil lamp, or today a light bulb, so that it can be seen from miles away. Made the keeper's job much easier, although the lens did have to be polished every morning. Nancy Rose also found herself with a new and rather unwanted responsibility in the very early 1900s after the opening of the Stony Point Battlefield State Park, which surrounds the lighthouse. She was now expected to give tours of the tower. Well, she and her family did not live in the lighthouse. There's nothing in there but a stairway up to the lantern. Instead, they had a small house nearby, about where I took this picture from. The house is long gone. And Nancy liked to tell visitors and reporters that it was a very dull existence up there on top of Stony Point, that nothing ever happened there. In fact, during her entire tenure as lightkeeper, only one ship ran aground within sight of the lighthouse. Everybody made it safely ashore. They then climbed the hill, and even though it was the middle of the night when they knocked on the lightkeeper's door, she let them in and fed them. And then in the morning, she showed them to the nearest railroad station so they could resume their trip to New York City. Now, the federal government shut this lighthouse down in 1925, replaced it with an automated beacon on the riverbank. But the tower remained in place, and it was fully restored in the 1980s when the Palisades Interstate Park Commission took over the operation of the Battlefield Park. And by the early 1900s, there were more than a dozen lighthouses on the Hudson River. The northernmost were located about 20 miles south of Albany. One of them was named for a town on the west side of the river. That's pronounced Coxsackie, and it comes from an Algonquin word meaning the place of the owls. Coxsackie was a major river port in the 19th century. The business district included several hotels, an opera house. About 30 of the old buildings are now preserved as the Reed Street Historic District, most of them with modern shops or restaurants on the ground floors. Along the waterfront, you had the factories and the warehouses, but the town of Coxsackie faced on the narrowest part of the Hudson, south of Albany. And right in the middle of the river, you had two low, narrow islands, one called Coxsackie, the other called Rattlesnake. So in 1830, the government built a small wooden lighthouse at the tip of Rattlesnake Island. They replaced it in 1868 with this square brick lighthouse and attached keeper's house. A man named William Hoos tended those lights for a total of 32 years. After he died, his wife and son took over for a while. In the 1920s, the keeper was a man named Jerome McDougall, and he was quite popular with the locals on both sides of the river. In the summertime, he would bring out his record player and host dance parties on the lighthouse porch. He also served for a few years as the scoutmaster for the local Boy Scout troop. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard decided this light was no longer needed and demolished it in 1940, replaced it with a much smaller automated beacon. Along the Hudson, sailors used to judge their distance from shore during foggy weather by firing off a gun or a cannon and then waiting for the echo. Well, this was done so often near Coxsackie that a hillside south of town was nicknamed Echo Hill. Now, the area became a bit quieter in 1831 when the government built a stone lighthouse on top of that hill. They named it after the nearby 4 Mile Point business district, which got its name from the fact that it was 4 miles from the center of Coxsackie. The stone tower was replaced with an iron lighthouse in 1880, and then the station was closed down and demolished in the 1920s. On the east side of the river, there's a town named after Peter Stuyvesant. He was the last Director General of New Amsterdam, also the man who surrendered New Amsterdam and the surrounding areas to the British in 1664. Oh, Peter Stuyvesant was more than willing to fight for the city, but he had made himself so unpopular with the citizens that when he called on them to defend the place, nobody showed up. He spent the next few years back in Europe trying to explain to his bosses what went wrong, but he did live out his final years back on Manhattan on his farm, or to use the Dutch word, Bowery, and that's where that part of the city got its name from. Now, the town of Stuyvesant was given that name in 1823, but its original name was Kinderhook Landing, because when Henry Hudson explored the river in 1609, the natives who met him at this spot brought along all of their children with them. So his sailors called this the Children's Corner, or Kinderhook. And Kinderhook was the birthplace of the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren. He was the first president born after 1776, and to date the only one who did not speak English as a child. His family only spoke Dutch. Well, when he got to Washington, D.C., he spoke so frequently about his hometown that associates nicknamed him Old Kinderhook. That amused him so much he began signing documents OK. There were 3 different Stuyvesant lighthouses built over the years. The first one, a wooden building built in 1829, that was destroyed just 3 years later by ice shifting along the river. A replacement was built in 1835, and then finally in 1868, this brick lighthouse was built on a round stone pier. When this one was no longer needed, it was demolished in 1933, and the stone from the pier was reused to make a porch for the post office in town. After the American Revolution ended in the early 1780s, the Royal Navy continued to harass the American whalers operating out of Nantucket and other New England ports. So one of the groups of whalers decided they would find a safer home port. Now, to find it, they had to sail about 100 miles up the Hudson River, where on the east side they found a little Dutch village called Claverack Landing. The name came from the Dutch word for clover. And these men were pretty clever. They brought prefabricated houses with them in the holds of their ships. They then set those up above the river bank, and in 1785 they chartered the city of Hudson. Within a few years, Hudson was the 8th largest city in the United States. Now, the whaling ships that left from there, they would be gone for years at a time. Most of them were heading for the South Pacific, so they were either sailing around the tip of South America or around Africa and through the Indian Ocean. And they would not return until the hold of the ship was filled with barrels of whale oil. The industry began to die out in the 1840s after oil was discovered in Pennsylvania. So today, the city of Hudson is better known for the many antique stores along its main street, as well as a firefighting museum and a restored opera house. Like the river, the city is named after Henry Hudson. Hudson was English, although he sailed for the Dutch East India Company. And like a lot of navigators in his day, he was looking for a shortcut to the ports of India and China. He sailed up the river that would later be named after him in 1609, hoping to find an entrance to what they called the Northwest Passage. This was a hoped-for water route over the Americas. Well, he didn't find it and turned around, but pretty incredible that he even attempted this voyage. He crossed the Atlantic in a wooden ship called the Half Moon. It was just 84 feet long, and he had a crew of 20 men. The Half Moon was also the first ship to run aground on the mudflats in the middle of the river, right near what would become the city of Hudson. They are now known as the Middle Ground Flats. The ship wasn't damaged, but Hudson did have to wait for the tide to turn so he could float free. In 1874, the Hudson City Lighthouse was built to mark the mudflats. One family would tend it for a total of 44 years. Henry Best was appointed keeper in 1874. After he died in 1893, his son Frank stayed on the job until 1918. Today, the building is called the Hudson-Athens Lighthouse, after the towns on both sides of the river. So this is what it looks like from Athens on the west side. I took this picture from a small park, which is where the ferries used to leave from, running back and forth between the cities. And you can get a good look here at the stone pier. The northern point of the pier is shaped like the prow of a boat, pointing up into the river. And there was a reason for that. Most winters, the Hudson freezes. Now, in the 19th century, the lighthouses were just shut down in the winter because with the river frozen, there were no ships to guide. But today, the Coast Guard uses icebreakers to keep a shipping channel open up the middle of the river all the way up to Albany. Well, a really dangerous time for the lighthouses was the early spring, when the ice began to melt. Because as it began to melt, it would often break up and pile up into what they called ice jams. And these could drift down the river as solid walls of ice. 2 of the Stuyvesant lighthouses were destroyed by ice jams, and several others on the river were damaged by them. I took these pictures a few years ago from the city of Poughkeepsie, New York. This is the former Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge. When that opened in 1888, it was the first Hudson River crossing south of Albany. It's more than a mile long, and it served as a railroad bridge until the 1970s when a fire destroyed part of the road deck. It was finally restored and reopened in 2009, the 400th anniversary of Hudson's voyage, but not as a railroad bridge. Today, it's a state park called the Walkway over the Hudson. And you get some great views from up there because it's over 200 feet high. It's also located just north of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Mid-Hudson Bridge. Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York State when this bridge opened in 1930. Now, the United States Lighthouse Board was part of the United States Treasury Department. And of course, the Treasury was always keeping an eye on its money. So they looked for ways to save money. When they built a major seacoast lighthouse, for example, the Cape Cod or Highlands Light here, they would hire a keeper and at least 2 assistants, and they all had to be paid. Well, they didn't have to be paid well. In the late 1800s, the head keeper of a lighthouse made about $600 a year. Assistants were paid about half of that. But the Lighthouse Board designated the smaller lighthouses, river lights, harbor or inlet lights. They called these family stations. And that meant that, yeah, they would hire a lightkeeper, but the only help he was getting would come from his wife and their children if they had any. After the Coast Guard took over operation of the lighthouses in 1939, they usually allowed these civilian keepers to remain on duty either until they retired or until their lights were automated or deactivated. The last civilian keeper at Hudson was a man named Emil Brunner. He arrived there in 1930, but his family was still growing. By 1937, he and his wife had 5 children. It's not a very big lighthouse, so he rented a house on the shore in Athens. Family lived there. He would row out to the lighthouse each afternoon, back in the morning. In December of 1846, the Saturday Evening Post featured the lighthouse on their cover. That's Mr. Brunner in the boat rowing out to the light with his youngest son, Norman. And because this was the Christmas issue, the boat is filled with presents, and he's even got the tree in the boat. Well, Mr. Brunner retired in 1949 when the light was automated. The Coast Guard does still maintain the beacon, but starting in the 1980s, a local preservation society has restored the building, and they run occasional summertime boat tours out there. Up until 2017, some of those tours were even hosted by Emil Brunner's first child. Her name was Emily. She lived to the age of 92, and she used to tell visitors what it was like living and working at the lighthouse. Now, another way the Lighthouse Board sometimes saved money, they reused the plans for lighthouses. This is an old postcard showing the Stepping Stone Lighthouse. That's out in Long Island Sound and can be seen from the long ramp leading up to the Throgs Neck Bridge out to Long Island. This light has also been automated for quite a long time, but I read recently that some of the towns on the north shore of Long Island have gotten together to start raising money to someday restore this lighthouse and maybe even open it up for tours. The town of Saugerties is on the west side of the Hudson, where Esopus Creek flows into the river. The town gets its name from a Dutch phrase that meant Sawyer's Creek. The Dutch had been building sawmills there since the 1600s. The first Saugerties lighthouse was built in 1838 and stood on a small stone pier out in the river. Well, when the Lighthouse Board decided to build a new, larger lighthouse of brick in 1869, they needed a larger pier. The new one was 60 feet in diameter. But they left the old pier in the river, built a bridge out to it, and for a long time there was a boathouse out there and some other storage buildings. One family named Crowley spent 30 years at this lighthouse. Dennis Crowley was appointed keeper in 1865, but soon had to step down because his eyesight was failing. At that time, his son Daniel took over for a while. And then from 1873 until 1885, Dennis's daughter, Katie, served as lightkeeper. Now, she and her sister, Ellen, continued to care for their parents. By then, her father had gone completely blind. They ran the lighthouse, and because they had both grown up along the river, they were very skilled with boats. They were both good swimmers, and Katie is credited with some rather daring rescues. One winter, she even dove through a hole in the ice on the river to rescue somebody who had fallen through. The last Crowley to tend the lighthouse was Dennis's grandson, James. He was there from 1885 until 1895. Well, this lighthouse was electrified in the late 1940s, and then in 1954, the Coast Guard automated it. What that meant is you had a machine to turn the light on at night and off in the morning. There was another machine in the lantern that could replace a burnt-out light bulb. So the Coast Guard just had to stop by a few times each year to install fresh bulbs and to do some basic maintenance. But without a keeper, without a family living there, the building quickly fell into disrepair, weather, vandalism. And if the building deteriorated too much, the Coast Guard might just remove the lantern, set it up on a steel frame tower, and demolish the building. So we did almost lose this one, and would have, except for the efforts of a local historian named Ruth Reynolds Glunt. Her husband, Chester, had been an inspector for the Coast Guard, so she used to travel with him. She knew all the lights on the river, the families that used to tend them, and from their own riverfront home, they could see the Saugerties light. They could see what was happening to it. So she wrote a book called Lighthouses and Legends of the Hudson, and then worked with a local architect to get the Saugerties light placed on the National Register of Historic Places. That was in 1978. In 1985, a nonprofit called Saugerties Lighthouse Conservancy bought the building from the government. Paid $1 for it, but the place was a bit of a fixer-upper. They had to replace all of the interior walls and floors and stairs. They built a replica of the original lantern, replaced about 10,000 bricks on the outside of the building. But in the 1990s, they were able to open this up as the only lighthouse bed and breakfast on the Hudson River. The innkeeper lives on the first floor. That's where you'll find the kitchen and a small museum and gift shop. Upstairs, they've got 2 guest rooms that are rented out. Because it's only 2 guest rooms, you may have to book a year or more in advance. You can get to the lighthouse by boat and tie up at the old pier, or you can walk there from the town of Saugerties. It's about a half-mile trail through the Ruth Reynolds Glunt Nature Preserve. Now, this is why the check-in and check-out times are based on the local tide tables. There's a 4-foot tide on the Hudson River all the way up to Albany, and parts of this trail are known to flood at high tide. There are, however, several other lighthouses that you can spend the night at. Off of Newport, Rhode Island, there's the Rose Island Lighthouse. That one was built in 1870. A little bit of a catch here. Visitors are expected to spend part of their stay helping to maintain the building and the grounds. For more of a vacation experience, there's the West Dennis Lighthouse on Cape Cod, a few miles from Hyannis. This is also known as the Lighthouse Inn, and the building was expanded quite a bit in the 1930s after it was converted to a hotel. The property also includes a private beach and a miniature golf course. At the northern tip of Cape Cod, rooms are available in the keeper's house of the Race Point Lighthouse. Just be warned that this building is a good 2 miles from the nearest parking lot, and what they call a road up there is just a trail through the dunes. You need a four-wheel drive to get there. Out on the west coast, the East Brother Island Lighthouse. They rent rooms in the lighthouse and in the neighboring fog signal building. Just a heads up, that fog signal is still in frequent use. This lighthouse is in northern San Francisco Bay. Coming back to the Hudson River, that's the Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge in the distance. Kingston is on the west side of the river where Rondout Creek meets the Hudson. And Kingston actually started as two Dutch villages founded in the 1650s. The British renamed one of those Kingston when they took it over in 1664. The city was then very briefly the first capital of New York State in 1777. That's also why British troops burned the place that October. By then, the provisional government had gone into hiding. The business did pick up after the Erie Canal opened in 1825, but what really made Kingston a major port, manufacturing, and shipbuilding city was the opening of another canal 3 years later, the Delaware and Hudson. This was built in 1828 to move coal from the mines in Pennsylvania across New York State to Kingston, where it could be shipped down the Hudson River. Chief engineer on the canal was a man named John Bloomfield Jervis. The city of Port Jervis, New York, is named after him. He started his career working on the Erie Canal. He was quickly promoted to resident engineer for the entire middle section of that canal, later worked on several railroads, and was the chief engineer for the Croton Aqueduct, which was built between 1838 and 1848 to bring fresh water almost 40 miles down to New York City. This is the High Bridge, which carried the pipes across the Harlem River to Manhattan. To design this bridge, he worked with a New York architect named James Renwick Jr., who's probably best known for designing St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. Began building that church in 1858. The project was interrupted by the Civil War, so it was not completed or dedicated until 1879. Renwick also designed the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C. That was built in 1855. And he designed this small brownstone lighthouse, which stands in the middle of New York City's East River, at the northern tip of Roosevelt Island. In the background is a pedestrian bridge crossing from 103rd Street to Randall's Island. Well, south of the High Bridge, you might spot a small lighthouse on top of an office building in the Bronx. This was built in 1929 on top of the headquarters of the reference publisher H.W. Wilson. They were best known for putting out the annual Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. Of course, it was never an official lighthouse. It was never used to guide ships. But it has been lit since the late 90s, and after new owners converted the building to a storage facility in 2012, they painted the old copper tower bright red. Well, the busy Kingston waterfront was not actually on the Hudson River. It was along the smaller Rondout Creek. That's where you'd find the factories and the shipyards and the warehouses. And when the city's businessmen ran out of room on shore, they created an artificial island in the middle of the creek. You can see it here on the left side of the screen under the Port Ewan Suspension Bridge. That opened in 1921, replacing an old ferry that had been pulled across that creek with chains. So in 1837, a lighthouse was built to mark the intersection of Rondout Creek and the Hudson River. It was a wooden building on a stone pier, and it was already in pretty sad shape when George Murdoch was appointed keeper in 1856. The following year, he was rowing supplies out to the lighthouse, could only get there by boat, when his boat capsized and he drowned in the river. That left his widow, Catherine, not only with a lighthouse to tend, but with 3 young children. Well, that winter, when the lighthouse was closed down, Catherine traveled down to Washington, D.C., and asked the lighthouse board to appoint her as the full-time keeper at the light. Their first response was, "We don't hire female lightkeepers." But she continued to ask until they gave her the job, and she stayed on for another 50 years. When her children were young, she would row them to shore so they could go to school each morning, back in the afternoon. In 1867, they got to move into this new bluestone lighthouse on a round stone pier. Summertime, they'd watch the steamships from the pier. Weekends, she would give tours of the lighthouse. In 1880, their son James was appointed as assistant keeper. He was finally promoted to head keeper when his mother retired in 1907. This building is no longer standing. Coast Guard tore it down in the 1950s after part of the roof collapsed. By then, the building had already been sitting empty for several decades. All that remains is the stone pier out in Rondout Creek. The reason the lighthouse was abandoned: starting in the 1880s, the Army Corps of Engineers built a new system of dikes at the entrance to the creek, and they changed its course so much that it made the old lighthouse almost useless. So in August of 1915, James Murdoch moved into the third Kingston Lighthouse, confusingly listed as Rondout 2. Like a lot of lighthouse keepers, he's credited with saving lives along the river. He even once went out to help the pilot of a seaplane who landed in the river with engine troubles. Now, James Murdoch retired in 1923. Coast Guard electrified the station in 1946 and then automated it in 1954. But they also paid a local man to serve for the next few decades as caretaker. He would watch from shore to make sure the light came on each night. About once a week, he would go out to inspect the building, and he could also turn the fog signal on from shore. The Hudson River Maritime Museum was founded on the riverbank in 1980. The exhibits include this 1898 steam tugboat called the Matilda. The museum began restoring the interior of the lighthouse to its 1930s appearance in 1984. 4 years later, they opened it up for boat tours. You still can only get there by boat. Finally, in 2002, the Coast Guard gave the building to the city of Kingston, but it is still maintained by the museum. And the Coast Guard still maintains the beacon, which is solar powered these days. That's the solar panel there right next to the lantern. Also from the Kingston waterfront, you can take sightseeing tours of the Hudson River. This is a boat called the Rip Van Winkle, which operates out of there. From there, you get river views of some of the mansions along the river in places like Hyde Park. This one belonged to Frederick William Vanderbilt. He was the Commodore's grandson, and he ran the New York Central Railroad for more than 60 years. His neighbor, Franklin Roosevelt, used to joke that Vanderbilt was the only person who didn't mind when the New York Central trains rattled past their homes. He would just jingle the change in his pockets. And by the way, this is the smallest of the Vanderbilt family mansions. It only had 54 rooms. But hey, they only used it for 2 months every autumn. You can also get a close-up look at the last wooden lighthouse on the Hudson, the Esopus Meadows Lighthouse, built in 1838 to mark shallows on the west side of the river. At low tide, the water was just a few feet deep. The present building was built in 1871, stands on a square stone pier. The first floor was the kitchen, sitting room, storage space. Upstairs, you had 3 bedrooms. For many years, a keeper and his family lived there. When the Coast Guard took over, they appointed 3 keepers to the station. Usually 2 would be on duty, 1 would be on leave. In 1990, the nonprofit Save Esopus Lighthouse Commission began leasing the building from the Coast Guard, began restoring it in the early 2000s. I think it was about 10 years ago when I took this picture, and you can see they were working on the outside of the building. The restoration has continued inside, so they do open it up for occasional summertime boat tours, and it has been relit with a modern replica of the original Fresnel lens. You can see it from out on the water, you can see it from some of the riverfront parks, and you can see it from the grounds of some of the estates along the river, including Wilderstein and Statsburg. Now, the ocean tides keep the Hudson salty all the way up to Newburgh and Beacon. The bridges joining those cities, the first was built in 1963. A second matching span was built in 1980. With the approaches, they're each more than 2 miles long. And north of Newburgh, jutting out from the west side of the river, you had a rocky point of land. In the 1660s, Dutch settlers noticed a group of Native Americans out there dancing around a bonfire one night. Completely misinterpreting what they were seeing, The settlers called the point the Devil's Dance Hall. Well, part of the Dutch phrase survives in the point's modern name of Danskammer Point. And on a foggy evening in March of 1882, a 300-foot steamship called the Thomas Cornell was heading downriver from Kingston and crashed right into the point. The passengers and crew made it safely ashore. They were rescued about an hour later by another steamship heading out of Poughkeepsie. But the ship was so badly damaged that after removing the engines and other machinery, the owners just let it sink in the river. And a few years later, an iron lighthouse tower was built on the rubble of the point. It stood on top of a small oil storage building. And this remained in use until the 1920s, when it was demolished. There is now a power plant there. A man named James Woyce was appointed keeper in 1886. He was still on the job in 1914 when the iron tower was struck by lightning. The shock did leave him partly paralyzed, but he remained on duty until the morning when he closed down the lighthouse. Only then did he make his way home and call a doctor. He recovered well enough to return to work and stayed there until 1919. Continuing down the river, we'll pass Bear Mountain. The bridge opened there in 1924, first automobile crossing south of Albany. It also carries the Appalachian Trail across the Hudson. And then we head down to Sleepy Hollow, New York, just north of Tarrytown. It's on the east side of the river. And the lighthouse we'll see there was a new type of light that made its debut in 1876 at the American Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Instead of brick or stone or wood, the tower was made of cast iron. It was made in a factory, it was shipped in pieces, and then assembled on site. So all that summer, they had a keeper living at the exposition, lighting the light every night, showing it to visitors. The following year, 1877, an identical lighthouse was assembled at the entrance to Connecticut's New Haven Harbor. Today it's called the Southwest Ledge Lighthouse. It's been automated since the 1950s, shows a flashing red light. And when it was built, it replaced the earlier 4 Mile Point Lighthouse, which you can see reflected here in the window of a carousel house in New Haven's Lighthouse Point Park. Well, over the next few decades, offshore cast iron lighthouses became a common sight in Long Island Sound, as well as in Delaware Bay. This is the Harbor of Refuge Lighthouse. It was built in 1926. Photographed this a few years ago on a northbound ferry heading back to Cape May, New Jersey. And there were some of these cast iron lighthouses in New York Harbor. This one is called the Robbins Reef Lighthouse. It's also known as Kate's Light, after a longtime keeper, Kate Walker, who took over after her husband died there of pneumonia. Because of their shape, these are sometimes called spark plug lights. They're also known as caisson lights for the way they were built. The construction begins by making a mound of loose rock that's called riprap. A hollow is left in the center. That's where the lighthouse board would assemble a cast iron caisson that was mostly filled with concrete to form a sturdy base for the tower. And this is the Sleepy Hollow, or Tarrytown, or Kingsland Point Lighthouse. It's been called by all of those names since it was first lit in October of 1883. The largest room in that tower is the first floor. It's only about 18 feet in diameter. That was the kitchen and living room. The second and third floors were bedrooms for the lighthouse keeper and his family. The first 3 levels, the inside of the iron walls, were lined with brick for insulation, brick making being a big industry along the Hudson. The 4th floor was either a spare bedroom or a storage room. And the smallest room in the lighthouse was just below the lantern. It was called the watch room, and it was basically a workspace for the keeper. And yes, this was built as a family station, even though it stood a quarter of a mile offshore. When the river froze in the winter, the keeper and his family would walk across the ice to go shopping in town. But in the 1890s, John Brisbane Walker became the editor and publisher of the Cosmopolitan magazine. It was a family magazine back then, running articles on science and travel and art, alongside popular fiction and poetry. But Mr. Walker was very interested in technology. So in 1896, he built a factory on the Tarrytown waterfront to build steam-powered automobiles under license from the Stanley brothers. Sold the factory in 1903 to the Maxwell Briscoe Company, another auto manufacturer, and they sold it in 1915 to Chevrolet. Well, in 1918, Chevy became part of General Motors, and over the next half-century, GM enlarged the factory site with landfill until the lighthouse was just 50 feet from shore. So in the 1970s, a short bridge was built from the factory property out to the lighthouse pier. The factory has since been demolished. The grounds are now a housing development and a park with a long trail along the riverbank. Now, this lighthouse originally showed a flashing white light. You could see it up to 14 miles away. In the early 1900s, it was converted to a flashing red light, and then in 1961, Coast Guard closed it down. They replaced the lighthouse with navigational beacons on the Tappan Zee Bridge, which had opened in 1955. Well, in 1969, the Westchester County Parks Department acquired the lighthouse after learning that the Coast Guard was planning to demolish it. The county then restored it as a museum, which they reopened in 1983 for the light's 100th anniversary. It's still open for occasional tours, and of course the light has now long outlived the bridge that replaced it. I took this picture a few years ago as they were starting to build the two new spans across the Hudson River. The 1955 bridge has since been demolished, and a lot of the steelwork was taken offshore and sunk to form artificial reefs. Now, Tarrytown was not the only cast iron lighthouse on the Hudson. This is Rockland Lake on Hook Mountain. That's on the west side of the river. In the 1960s, the Palisades Interstate Park Commission transformed the area around the lake into a state park with a big swimming pool, picnic areas. The main trail around that lake is more than 3 miles long. And from the mid-1800s right up until 1924, the Knickerbocker Ice Company had as many as 3,000 men working on that lake every winter. The rest of the year, they either worked on their own farms or for the various quarries along the river. Now, during the winter, they were cutting blocks of ice from the lake. Those ice blocks were stored in giant warehouses along the lake shore. You can still see some of the foundations. The walls above the foundations were made of wood. They were double walls with sawdust packed in between for insulation. And that actually kept about 80% of the ice frozen until the spring and summer, when it was placed on an inclined railway down to the riverbank to be loaded onto the company's own ships. Most of the ice was taken down to New York City, but some was taken down the Atlantic coast to the southern states, and some was even shipped as far away as India. So in 1894, the Lighthouse Board built the Rockland Lake Lighthouse in the Hudson to guide ships into those docks. Unfortunately, they built it on an oyster bed, which proved to be an unstable foundation. The riprap kept washing away, and the tower was soon nicknamed the Leaning Tower of Rockland. By 1923, it was leaning so badly that the government removed it and replaced it with a much smaller automated light. Now, the oldest lighthouse still in operation in the United States stands in New Jersey at Sandy Hook. It was built in 1764, and it was originally called the New York Lighthouse because it was the merchants of New York City who paid for it with 2 lotteries, and they built it to guide ships into the harbor. But because there was so much shipping heading in and out of New York, this tower would get a lot of help over the years. The main shipping channel, it was called the Ambrose Channel, was marked by a floating light, or a light ship. And light ships had 2 lanterns on masts. One would be in use, the other was there as a spare. Since the 1960s, the lightship Ambrose has been preserved as a museum ship, and you can find that in South Street Seaport, Lower Manhattan on the East River, just south of the Brooklyn Bridge. On the opposite side of Manhattan, at Pier 26 in Hudson River Park, you can see another old lightship. This one is missing one of its masts, and it's used as a seasonal restaurant and bar. This is the Lightship Frying Pan. No, that was really its name. Lightships were named after the spots that they marked, and this had been used off the coast of North Carolina, marking a hazard labeled on maps as the Frying Pan Shoals, apparently for their shape. There were also smaller lighthouses in New York Bay, including the Fort Wadsworth Lighthouse on Staten Island. This guided ships through the Narrows, until the Verrazano Narrows Bridge was built in the 1960s. That bridge would be just off the right side of this picture. From 1886 until 1902, even the torch of the Statue of Liberty was used as a lighthouse. Although that's not what the sculptor Frederick Bartholdi intended. He wanted the light to be inside the head. That way the windows and the crown would light up like diamonds after dark. But tides and currents have gradually changed the shape of Sandy Hook. When the lighthouse was built, it was just 500 feet south of the northern tip. Today, it's about 1.5 miles south of the tip. So as early as the 1850s, the government had to build additional smaller lights to guide ships around the changing hook. And in 1880, they built a red cast iron tower north of the old stone light. This one stood about 40 feet tall, showed a flashing red light, had a fog bell, but then in 1917, the Army asked for it to be removed. Well, the United States had declared war on Germany, and the Army was building enormous gun batteries to defend the approaches to New York Harbor. And this little red lighthouse was right in the path of the new guns. So it was disassembled and taken up to Staten Island. It was Commodore Vanderbilt who started the Staten Island Ferry, and right next to the ferry docks, the lighthouse service had a storage depot. This is where the Fresnel lenses were assembled and tested when they arrived from overseas. It's also where they stored oil and paint and other supplies. The buildings and grounds are now being restored as a National Lighthouse Museum. Only the one building is currently open, but they've got pretty ambitious plans for the future. Now, the lighthouse service, and then later on the Coast Guard, used ships called tenders to deliver those supplies. They also brought keepers to new stations and brought inspectors around throughout the year. The tenders were always named after flowers or trees. This one was called the Lilac, served from 1933 up until 1973, and it's now preserved as a floating classroom. You'll often find it docked at Pier 25 in Lower Manhattan. In 1921, the Lighthouse Service reassembled the tower on a little point of land on northwestern Manhattan, a spot called Jeffrey's Hook. It was named after an 18th century ship captain and privateer. Since the late 1880s, the spot had been marked by 2 oil lamps on a wooden post. Now, this is a small lighthouse, nothing inside but a spiral stairway to the top. They never appointed an official keeper, just paid the superintendent of one of the nearby apartment buildings to walk down each night and turn the light on, come back, turn it off in the morning, and there was a fog signal he could turn on if it was needed. But just 10 years after this light was established, the George Washington Bridge opened. The towers are 600 feet high and brightly lit at night, so that didn't leave much use for the Little Red Lighthouse. And that was a bit of a problem. The tower had been built in Manhattan's Fort Washington Park, and it was built on the condition that if it became unnecessary, it would be removed from city property. Fort Washington was one of 2 forts that were built in 1776 to block British access to the Hudson. British troops captured it in November of that year. On the opposite side of the river, on top of the New Jersey Palisades, was Fort Lee. It's where the town got its name from. Washington abandoned this one before the British could capture it. Well, the Coast Guard kept the little lighthouse in operation until 1947. In 1951, they announced that they were going to auction it off. And the terms of the auction were pretty simple. If you placed the winning bid, you had 30 days to remove the lighthouse from city property. Well, as soon as that reached the newspapers, the City Parks Department began getting notes and letters from children all across the nation, some of them even enclosing donations of nickels and dimes, and they were asking the city to save the Little Red Lighthouse, because they had read this book, The Little Red Lighthouse and the Great Gray Bridge, written by Hildegard Swift, 1942, illustrated in watercolors by Lynd Ward. He did the sketching on site, finished the paintings in his studio. The book was a bestseller in its day. It's never been out of print. So the city asked if the Coast Guard, instead of selling the tower, would simply turn it over to the Parks Department. Coast Guard agreed, but it took the city another 30 years or so to actually restore the tower. It's still not usually open to visitors, but you can get a close-up look of it by walking down West 181st Street, rather steep hill down toward the river that takes you to a bridge over the Henry Hudson Parkway into Fort Washington Park. And now every year, usually late September or early October, the Parks Department sponsors a Little Red Lighthouse Festival, and they'll get a local celebrity down there to read the book to the children who have gathered. To the best of my knowledge, it's still the only lighthouse that was ever saved by a children's book. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for watching today. This brings us to the end of our tour of the lighthouses on the Hudson River. If you visit my website, which is simply kevinwoyce.com, you'll find a full schedule of when I'm speaking and which topics I'll be speaking about. You can also follow me on Facebook at Kevin Woyce Author or on Instagram at Kevin Woyce. And on the website, you can find links and information for the books that I've written and illustrated, including Hudson River Lighthouses, an illustrated history. Also written a history of the Statue of Liberty, and several books about my home state of New Jersey, including the Jersey Shore and the state parks. Those are all available on either Amazon or Barnes & Noble as paperbacks or ebooks. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.